As money markets point to a future recession here and in the United States, the question is, what can the Reserve Bank do about it right now? As you can see here, the Reserve Bank is well behind other global central banks in raising official interest rates. There is also an issue that if rates are raised too quickly, it will do more damage to the economy than it may cure. Warwick McKibbin is Distinguished Professor and Director of the ANU Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. Having spent a decade on the Reserve Bank board, he's now one of a dozen prominent Australian economists calling for a review of our central bank. Warwick McKibbin, many thanks for your time as always. Can you tell me first off, do you think that we are headed for the recession that we have to have?
Good to speak to you, Ross. I think the US is heading for a recession. I don't think Australia has to have a recession. We didn't have to have a recession in 1991. It was bad policy choices, and I think we can avoid a recession today.
So what are the things that the Reserve Bank, the central bank, needs to do now to avoid a significant economic downturn next year, potentially recession if they do make the wrong choices?
Well, I think the first issue is that it's not just up to the Reserve Bank. I think that's been the problem with macroeconomic policy for the last decade or more. You have to coordinate monetary policy, fiscal policy. You need a very clear energy and climate policy so that investors will go out there and start investing in new technologies, transmission, use of energy, electric vehicles, etc. So this is an all-of-policy issue that needs to be addressed. We've left it to central banks to pick up the pieces too many times, and now we're paying the price. So I think really we need firstly bipartisan agreement on what the policy strategy should be, and we need coordination between federal politicians and state politicians across the aisle. And then once you have a strategy, I think Australia would be in a good place to take advantage of the energy transition over time, but also to avoid the sort of incredible volatility we're going to see coming out of financial markets over the next 12 months.
OK, so you can identify the way to fix the issue, given what you see in the current state of politics and the cooperation between the states and the federal governments, and then between the central bank and the government as well. Do you have optimism that that can be achieved?
Well, I do, but again, it has to be a bipartisan agreement. We have to have all sides of politics to agree on what the best way forward is, and to take on the challenges. The challenges that we face in Australia is low real wage growth. We need high productivity. That'll help with wage earners. That'll also help with balancing the fiscal books. But we also need to realise that zero interest rates is a very dangerous place to be. The Reserve Bank should have been raising rates before now. I think they did the right thing with cutting rates when they did. As the Governor says, it was an insurance policy. But a year ago, I was thinking that rates today should be at least 1%. Now we know what inflation is doing today. Rates should be well above where they are. And so there needs to be a clear strategy from the central bank of how rates will rise, and a coordination with the fiscal policy on how they're going to help smooth spending in the economy. This will hurt some parts of the economy a lot. And so the distributional impacts, I think, are more important than the aggregate macroeconomic impacts of this policy tightening.
OK, so just explain those areas of the economy that you are most concerned about as a result of the sharp increases in interest rates that are coming to head off the inflation.
Well, firstly, I think housing construction is going to be very severely impacted. We have the input costs are going up across the board: steel, timber, cost of labour, with all the damage that was done in the floods in Northern New South Wales and Queensland. There's a labour shortage in the building industry, and we don't have the immigration to the levels that would sustain demand. So I think those interest-sensitive sectors will be largely impacted. But again, really, anybody who thought interest rates were going to be at zero for the next 3 or 4 years, they shouldn't have made their plans based on that. That was really a conditional statement the Governor made, which they shouldn't have made, in my view. There's this forward guidance principle amongst all the central banks where if you can't cut interest rates because they're at zero, you tell the markets that you're going to hold interest rates at zero for a long time, and they want to stimulate demand through that mechanism. I don't think that works very well in any country, let alone in Australia.
So do you get the sense that some people may have borrowed money that they shouldn't have, that have bought houses that they shouldn't have, simply on the basis that it was suggested or given a very big hint that interest rates would not be moved up until at least 2024?
Well, at the time that statement was made, it was very conditional. The Governor did say that under current circumstances, and at the time we were going into a deep recession. So I think at the time it was a reasonable thing to say, but it should have been corrected much more quickly. We're now in 2022. Our modelling of the pandemic that we published at the beginning of 2020 had the economy recovering within 12 months. And so we've now gone well beyond that. And add on to that, not just the low interest rates, but the spending of governments at the federal and state level and the promises made during the election by both sides of politics. That's a massive demand stimulus on top of a supply shock coming from high costs, coming from energy prices, food prices, the war in Ukraine, and the collapse of production networks around the world. It's a very complicated situation, and that's why I think you need to have a very clear plan and a way forward.
Tell me then about the Reserve Bank. You've put your name to this list of 12 economists who have called for a review of the Reserve Bank, and most importantly, that the review be conducted by somebody from outside of Australia. Why did you put your name to that review?
Well, because I think we haven't had a review of the Reserve Bank. We haven't even had a recent review of the financial system for more than 2 decades. And we're facing a time in history where the entire world will be different. And we need to know that the Reserve Bank is fit for purpose. So it wasn't meant to be, from my point of view, a criticism of the bank's past performance. I was, in fact, involved in the bank from 2001 to 2011. I want someone to assess whether the current structure of the bank, the governance structure, the policy framework, the tools that they use for monetary policy, are they appropriate in a world where there's going to be a very large climate transition, where geopolitics and uncertainty across the world is causing enormous volatility? Is the central bank framework appropriate for the current current state of the world and the world we're expecting in the next 20 years? We should have that review not in a crisis. We should have that review when the economy is in a good place, because then you can think through the issues very clearly. Right now we're heading into a crisis and we're going to have a review, and that's a very bad way to reform the financial system or to reform any policies. In fact, climate policy should have been designed when there was time. We've run out of time now, and so they're going to have to put together something very piecemeal. They have to do it very carefully, but it's hard to reform during a crisis, and yet we always wait until there's a crisis to fix something because we don't think it's broken until we find out it is.
Warwick McKibbin, always good to chat to you, and many thanks for your time on the program today.
Great to be here, Ross. Thanks for having me.